SDK in context, lesson 1. So as we saw in the introduction, what we'll be discussing here is what the SDK is, what do we use it for and what we don't use it for, and its comparison with config tools. So first let's describe overall a development process within the framework. Any customization, any new piece of code that you need to introduce within the application goes through the following cycle. First of all, there are some database changes, and then you create an MO, a BO, some UI development, page navigation needs to be developed, there's plugin development, and there's batch development. Not all these things have to take place, but often some of them or a couple of them need to be done depending on what you need to do. But now we're describing when you need to create your own new table, your a new persistent data, and that you would be done by creating new tables as a data DPA would create the table structure, define the primary keys. And after that is done, the table metadata needs to be defined within the application. So that's something which can be done by a DBA, and it requires a little configuration, but there is no need for any real hard development, and definitely not for the SDK itself. To create your maintenance object, there are classes that need to be created, entity classes and service classes for the maintenance object. And that has to be coded. However, there are many wizards, we will describe them, that help you within the SDK to create that relatively easily. There's also some base defaulting validation that is done through something called change handlers. Once that is complete, then the metadata for the maintenance object can be created within the app, and one has finished the stage of MO development. So the skills here is a little Java coding, but most of it is actually cut and paste from existing examples, and it isn't too difficult. After that, we really move into more config tools work, which is creating the business object, create the elements using the schema editor, lifecycle inheritance, BO options, choosing the right elements from the MO to create your BO. This is all firmly in the territory of config tools. The UI development that is needed around a business object is created either through UI hints, which is automatically generated. There's little work to be done within the actual HTML, or you can create your own UI map, which involves some HTML and JavaScript knowledge. As well as that, there are many things that need to still be done in order to have a fully functional piece of technology to be used within your app. And you need to create menus, portals, and zones. Again, this is config tools work. Scripting is involved, SQL to create certain zones, and you will need to do some BPA scripts in order to do navigation from the front end. When we come into plugin development, then you have a choice. You could either do the development in Java, or you can do it through scripting. There are advantages doing it in Java. Things go quicker, performance-wise, but scripting can be easy. You don't actually have to compile. And finally, if you're going to do some batch development, background processes that need to be programmed, that's definitely Java development. So if we had to summarize what different tools that are needed across the whole process here, at the beginning, if you're going to create your own new persistent data, then a DBA work is needed, but that's relatively trivial. And then the light blue I've shown you on MO development, there's a combination of config tools doing metadata for the table structure and a little bit of SDK work in order to create new entities for the new persistent data, as well as creating some change handlers for basic defaulting. Those parts which are shown in royal blue are really very much config tools work, very necessary for any new development that you need to do. And when we come into plugin development, then it partially can be done in config tools, or it can be done in the SDK through Java if you want to. It's only batch development which has to be done in Java, and that's shown in gray. So when you look at that, one could ask the question, does one really need to do too much SDK development? So I want to highlight those places where definitely SDK is necessary and you can't rely upon the config tools. First of all, if you want to create a new entity, then the only way to do that is to use SDK. If you use some base entities, and one can use, let's say, a new process flow, a new BO, you could use the process flow which is in the base within PSRM, for example. And then you would have to put your data in CLOB fields. And that comes possibly with a cost. And that is, holding data there is not necessarily optimized for performance if it's in a CLOB, for searching, and for retrieving as well. So it might be necessary in some circumstances to create your own entity. And therefore, in that case, as I said, the SDK is the only way to do that. To create a new entity, you have to create your new tables, you need to use the SDK. If, for example, you could use a existing base entity, but you want some basic defaulting changes and validation, you might need to change the change handlers, so that there's work there that might need to be done on an existing MO, or else you might need to create a new one because you might have slightly different needs surrounding, let's say, a log table. So there are definitely circumstances where you need to create new entities, and in that case, you have to use the SDK. When it comes to plugins, you always have a choice of whether to do a plugin in a script or whether to do it in Java. And the reasons to do it in Java are mainly to do with speed. Speed of access to data is much quicker. You have different types of techniques to access data within Java, as opposed to within config tools. The only options to access data really is through your business object or business service. That comes with a cost because you always have to read in the whole business object, and it could have many extra pieces of data that you're not necessary, and therefore data manipulation might be slow, and therefore you doing it in Java is definitely easier. You can precisely take the particular type of data property that you want to update, as opposed to taking the whole business object. Not all data within the system necessarily is BO based. If it's not BO based, you can't access it within a script. So therefore, sometimes you have to use Java. But mainly, the reason to go with a Java plugin as opposed to a config, meaning scripting plugin, is to do with performance, and that's why many of the base plugins are done in Java. The next reason to use the SDK is if you want to create a plugin spot. If you want a new place where a new algorithm type needs to be defined, and we will be showing that later on, then the only way to create a new plugin spot which does not exist within the system currently is to create that within the SDK. If you want to create a new business service, you want to wrap some process within a business service to expose it to config tools to use it within a script, or to expose it to generally so other piece of code can use the business service. To create a new one, the only way to do that is to do it via the SDK. Of course, there is one type of business service that can be done through config tools, and that is just a simple query using a zone. Again, that comes with an overhead. Using a zone, it also is a very specific type of business service of just retrieving data. If you would like to, again, do more than that within the business service, for example, to update information through the business service, then you have to do that within the SDK. Finally, if you want to create any batch process, you can't rely upon any of the batch processes that already exist within Base. The only way to create a batch process is to do it within Java. So these are the reasons why the SDK is important and why it is an important part of the whole development cycle. However, I would like to stress that as much as the SDK is important, config tools definitely is as vitally important for many parts of the development cycle, especially those ones in the middle that we saw before, like creating the BO, the UI development and navigation within the application. That has to be done through config tools. So there is a place for both, and it comes with experience and different knowledge sets are needed to actually deal with both.